Welcome to yet another NATO Strategic Communication Center of Excellence webinar. It's actually our webinar number 9, and it's rather exciting for us here in this cozy studio in Riga, and I hope the weather has been treating you much nicer than it has treated us here in Riga. In our previous events, we looked at different challenges that strategic communications professionals have been facing today. And we have looked at disinformation in Asia, how governments have handled communication in the time of COVID-19 crisis. We have looked into Russia's toolbox in the Western Balkan information environment, and much more. And I must say that you can watch our previous webinars on our YouTube channel and also on our Facebook page. One of the themes that was coming up quite a few times in the discussions that we are having before, in the comments section and in the questions, was China's disinformation. And we decided that, that we should have an event that will focus on this theme, which is rather important for us as a Center of Excellence, for anyone who is studying disinformation and looking at the information environment, as well for a broader strategic communications community. I would like to ask you to post your questions either on YouTube or Twitter or Facebook, wherever you are watching this live stream. And we are interested not only in questions, but also we are interested in comments. Maybe you can share some research or some findings from your home countries. So we really invite you to share your thoughts throughout this discussion on our social media channels. So NATO StratCom COE has looked at China's activities in the information space already before. For example, our hybrid threats report has several case studies that are looking into China. We looked at Confucius Institutes as well as China's public diplomacy in Taiwan. For example, our Arctic report looks at China's communications vis-à-vis the Arctic, as well as our academic journal has an article by Gary Buck on how to respond to China's Belt and Road Initiative. Rather frequently mentioned in these events, Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu believed that it is better to attack the enemy's mind than to attack fortified cities. And then People's Republic of China is a rather keen disciple of Sun Tzu, and it has been using modern media and social networks to attack the minds and win the hearts of Europeans in a rather skillful and so far underreported way. So I thought that maybe inviting a Sun Tzu quote here in this event is a rather good choice. Now, with that in mind, we have invited a fantastic panel of experts. First, we have Ms. Erika Kinetz. She is a Shanghai correspondent with the Associated Press, and she has also worked with the FR Lab looking at China's disinformation and activities in the information environment. We have Ms. Mareike Ohlberg. She's a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States Asia Program. And we also have Mr. Frederick Fooy, who used to be our NATO StratCom COE senior expert, and it's really nice to invite our previous colleagues to our events, but currently he's a senior analyst at the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency. I would like to start this discussion with Erika, and she will be focusing on China's disinformation in a broader context and also in the context of COVID-19. Erika, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Delighted to be here. I guess I'll just start from a perspective of COVID. I think looking at Chinese propaganda in the age of COVID, we can say it's something of a new era for China. And I mean that in two ways. I mean that there's been an evolving structure to China's global information apparatus and also a change in the content of its messaging. So structurally, what you've seen is a surge onto Western social media platforms, namely Twitter and Facebook, of Chinese diplomats and diplomatic embassies. So we looked at a sample of about 200 accounts and found that, going back 10 years, and found that over half of them had been created since September of 2019. And this comes against a backdrop of high-level messaging to the diplomatic corps to increase their fighting spirit when it comes to giving China an international voice that's more commensurate with its economic heft. And I think that this movement of Chinese diplomats onto Western social media platforms has to be seen as an evolution of a long-standing effort by the Communist Party to create a global media presence. This dates back years. And you can see this, for example, through Chinese state-backed media outlets creating content in multiple languages and broadcasters in multiple languages in multiple countries across multiple social media platforms outside of China. They have a long-standing approach, long-standing presence on Facebook and Twitter, and have amassed significant followers. You know, some Chinese state media outlets have followers ostensibly in the tens of millions. You've also seen the party's efforts at buying inserts in major Western publications, from the Washington Post to the Helsinki Times. And with COVID, you saw all of these aspects of China's global information machine operationalized. So I think it gives us a chance to see how China's global information architecture can function. And I don't mean to suggest that the Chinese media space is monolithic, is free of dissent, is completely controlled from the center, because I don't think any of that is true. But I think COVID gives you a chance to understand how the system can work. And what you can see with some of the COVID messaging is that China can use this infrastructure to effectively syndicate Beijing's messaging across languages, across countries, across platforms to potential audiences in the hundreds of millions. There's certainly caveats to that. You know, we don't know how many of these followers are real and how many are fake. We don't know who's actually picking up the messaging, and we don't know how it's impacting them. But if you just step back and look at the information architecture that China is building and continues to improve upon, it gives you some sense of the sweep of China's ambition. In terms of the evolution of the content of China's messaging around COVID, I think the most striking change is a shift from positive to negative messaging. So traditionally, Chinese propaganda has been focused on extolling the virtues of China and the achievements of China and the possibilities for win-win cooperation with the party and, you know, the superior stability of China's system of governance. With COVID, the party seems to have really turned and taken a page from Russia's playbook of actively promoting misinformation and becoming a bit more sophisticated at exploiting existing schisms and weaknesses within, for example, the United States. I think the most prominent example of this is, of course, Zhao Lijian, the foreign ministry spokesman, who in mid-March now famously tweeted that the coronavirus may have been leaked by a military laboratory in Fort Detrick and brought to China during the Wuhan military games. And he also explicitly said that maybe this came from the US Army. That kind of sort of active disinformation is pretty new for China, I think. One thing that I find interesting about this narrative is that you can actually see the seeds of those stories in the United States itself. So if you look back in January, you can see QAnon and anti-vax groups also circulating these ideas that COVID was created by the military or by deep state actors who were trying to weaken the presidency of Donald Trump. And so then when Chinese state-linked actors decided to amplify this message for their own strategic interests, they're building on ideas that were already in circulation in North America, and they had foreign sources to draw on that could potentially add credibility to their claims. So for example, when Zhao Lijian tweeted out these theories, he cited a Canadian research group called Global Research Canada, which has long been on the radar of Kremlin watchers. I think there's also a case to be made that, you know, China's increasing aggressiveness in its messaging, you know, has moved in tandem and sort of as a response to US messaging around coronavirus. So going back to January, there was this, a man in Inner Mongolia posted a video on a social media platform in China that said coronavirus is a genetic weapon. He was arrested, he was detained, and he was fined. And People's Daily broadcast his story, showing him in, you know, shackled in a tiger chair with his legs in a cage, to reinforce the message to the Chinese audience that you can be arrested for spreading false information online. 6 weeks later, Zhao Lijian is tweeting basically the same content. So what shifted in those 6 weeks? Well, two things changed. One, Li Wenliang, the doctor from Wuhan who raised an early alarm about this mysterious pneumonia and then was punished for it, passed away, creating a huge public outpouring of grief and rage over early missteps in China's mismanagement of the COVID crisis. But secondly, you started to see more aggressive talk from US actors, specifically Senator Tom Cotton began raising theories in a congressional hearing and then on Fox News that this might have been leaked from a laboratory in China. So this shift, these changes in China's approach to propaganda have not been without controversy within China, and lots of questions have been raised about what the cost of this, specifically this turn towards negativity, might be. It's difficult to do this traditional approach, raising China as a responsible big power and also spreading conspiracy theories. It's difficult to hold those two things side by side. So given that this change comes with both controversy and a potential cost, I think it's worth asking, what does China gain through this new kind of surge of wolf warrior diplomacy? And one obvious answer is that it gains followers. So, you know, aggressive messaging on Western social media platforms and COVID conspiracy theories in particular have helped Chinese diplomats drastically increase their Twitter base, their Twitter followers. So if you look at the accounts of both Zhao Lijian and his fellow MOFA spokesperson Hua Chunying. If you look at their Twitter account growth over March, when most of this disinformation, when they first took this very sharp approach to disinformation, their Twitter followers doubled and tripled. Secondly, perhaps counterintuitively, messaging on Twitter actually does reach quite a large domestic audience, or it can reach quite a large domestic audience, even though Twitter is banned inside of China. So Zhao Lijian's tweets sparked hashtag conversations on Weibo that got over 300 million views and sparked over 60,000 conversations. And the last thing I'll say in terms of potential gains is that if you try to begin to analyze the structure of state-linked social media accounts, it appears that Chinese diplomatic accounts have effectively seeded fresh sort of areas of engagement outside of the already operational base of the Chinese state media infrastructure. They've seeded sort of fresh conversations in places like Panama, Brazil, and Japan. And I think as China begins to experiment with new ways of exploiting Western social media platforms, that will continue to raise questions for the platforms themselves in terms of how they handle state-leaked content. I mean, I think the platforms are actively grappling with this question. We've seen Facebook recently change its policy, but implementation will continue to be a challenge. I mean, YouTube, for example, since 2018 has said it will flag state-backed content, but it's still possible today to find conspiratorial COVID content created by Chinese state media on YouTube that is not flagged as being state-linked. So in the interest of time and brevity, I think I'll leave it there and hand it off to Frederick.
If I may just jump in a bit, I wanted to ask you a little question, and that you already touched upon the China using Russia's toolbox, and one of the quite a few actually researches that we have done ourselves at the NATO StratCom Center of Excellence have looked at how they communicate, how Russian media communicates for the external and internal audiences. And you said that Twitter is actually reaching their internal audiences in China as well, but probably there is a kind of different messaging for external audiences and internal audiences, especially now that it has changed, because before China's communication was about constructive cooperation, and currently there's a lot of anti-US, anti-European, anti-Japanese information being spread. And how do you look at this change, and how change of external communication and maybe internal communication as well?
I think if you take the Zhao Lijian as a case study, I think what that allowed China to do was to create this image. It sort of plays to a nationalistic base, and you can see Chinese officials standing up globally and speaking out loudly in defense of China's sovereignty and China's interests. And I think that plays quite strongly to a nationalist base. I think other people really, including people within the party in positions of authority, object to this and don't think that it's a good tactic and believe that China should take a different road on social media. But in a way, it allows China to use Twitter to its own end. They can operationalize Twitter without having to let Twitter function without censorship domestically.
Thank you, Erika. Well, Frederick, the floor is yours. Frederick will cover what's happening in Sweden and also in the Nordic-Baltic information environment, and we're very excited to learn more. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Linda, and I'm very glad to be back in Riga, albeit only virtually, unfortunately. So let me chat a bit about the Nordic-Baltic region for starters. Now, we're geographically quite a ways from Beijing, but still of significant importance. And why is that? Well, one of many reasons is that the Nordic-Baltic region is the future nexus between the Belt and Road Initiative, or rather the Northern Outlier, and the future Arctic Silk Road. So that means that this is the connection essentially between Central Europe and Northern Europe in terms of Kinetz or wherever the major ports for China will be in the future. The Nordic-Baltic region also has some unique qualities that are interesting or irritating to China. First of all, this is a technical hub of development. We have 5G development both in terms of Ericsson and Nokia. And also the other Nordic-Baltic countries are, after all, strong democracies, outspoken when it comes to human rights. And in the case of Sweden, we also have a Swedish citizen, the publisher Gui Minhai, who has been apprehended by the Chinese authorities for several years now and was recently sentenced as a foreign agent by China. They also claim that he has renounced his Swedish citizenship, which is not the case. So, besides these factors, the Nordic-Baltic region remains it is interesting for China for technical reasons and from the viewpoint of, we point out human rights violations, and we also, in the case of Sweden, we give asylum to Uyghurs who flee from China. So if we go more specifically towards Sweden, there's the Chinese-Swedish relations are unfortunately at an all-time low, and I will really try to avoid talking about China and talk more about the Chinese Communist Party. Starting in September 2018, there was a clear difference in the communication between the CCP through the embassy and Sweden. There were several cases of the Chinese ambassador voicing his opinions about Swedish freedom of press, Swedish opinions regarding human rights, of course, and that Sweden was meddling in Chinese internal affairs by pointing out, for example, the situation in Xinjiang, etc. There's also been harassment of Swedish journalists, both online and over the phone. And this has been going on in a rather ham-fisted way from the CCP. So we have seen several narratives that have been aimed at Sweden. Some of them are common for all over the Western world. For example, the Cold War mentality. China represents something new, something modern. It represents the future. When we stick to pointing out violations of aggression in China, then it's a Cold War mentality. We also see narratives along the line that Sweden is xenophobic, but we have very few cases of racism against Asians or Chinese in Sweden. But that's also part of one of the standard narratives. Sweden is a dangerous place to visit, especially for Asians. And here you can see some similarities between the Chinese narratives and the Russian narratives when it comes to a society in decay, where you have a limited amount of control from the authorities over the society. And when it comes to the pandemic, which of course is, you cannot avoid mentioning the narratives in the without mentioning the pandemic. But Sweden has been noticed for its unique handling of the pandemic. And this has been utilized by the CCP to point out that Sweden is an outlier. Sweden is perhaps not to be trusted. The European Union nations should reconsider its work with Sweden due to Sweden's perceived inability to handle the pandemic. I believe there might be some questions regarding the cooperation between the Russian Federation and China regarding influence activities. So we can jump into that, or we can leave that until after Mareike's presentation.
Thank you, Frederick. Actually, there indeed is a question about that, and it's from Jill, who is a journalist in US, and she's asking what are key differences between Chinese propaganda, disinformation, and Russia's narrative structure of disinformation actors. Maybe you can take this question.
I will gladly do that. As Erika mentioned, that the traditional CCP propaganda, I believe in Chinese, the word for propaganda and information is the same. So the traditional propaganda has been about China as a global power for good. You want to be allied with China. Things will go well if you ally with China. They have definitely picked up the Russian ways of spreading concern, insecurity, questioning what is actually going on. You know, what is the pandemic from? Of course, the case of Fort Detrick has been commonly mentioned, but one should also bear in mind that there are several arrangements and agreements between CCP state media and media of the Russian Federation. There's at least a dozen various agreements, and many of these agreements have been signed during 2019. You have, for example, cross-training and exchange programs between journalists of the major Chinese state outlets and Russian Federation state outlets. So there's plenty of platforms for them to learn of each other. And I would say that the CCP is rapidly picking up some of the greatest successes of the Kremlin influence activities. The problem is still, however, there's a cognitive barrier. It is difficult for CCP to get its language across, even when trying to adapt Western norms in terms of communication. But once again, they are working rapidly to pick up. And bear in mind that influence activities is still one of the most cost-effective ways of engaging a target and getting effect, achieving effect in the target. You can use it 24/7, the range is unlimited, and the accountability is low.
And it seems that one of the strategies that has been used is actually one that we've seen with Russia and in the context of downing the MH17, and it's creating a fog of uncertainty where you don't really understand what's happening, where is the truth, and by creating a feeling that, you know, no one really knows anything. Well, it's not really a question, but if you want to address that.
No, absolutely. Contributing to uncertainty, and especially when we're dealing with the pandemic, when the various target audiences around the globe, they are spending much more time, voluntarily or involuntarily, in front of a screen and seeking out both traditional and alternative media sources. And there is, for obvious reasons, a much greater general feeling of uncertainty in the population, and this can be exploited. But China has not, as far as I'm concerned, achieved the same knowledge of its target audience as the Kremlin. But they are rapidly reaching that point, and that will be problematic.
Thank you, Frederick. I think we will probably go back to similarities between Russia and CCP in a while again, but now I would like to give floor to Ms. Mareike Ohlberg to give a broader look at China's media and digital policies, as well as the Chinese Communist Party's influence campaigns in Europe. The floor is yours.
Right, thank you so much for having me. I want to go back to the two main strains of disinformation or information offensive that we have seen from China during this COVID-19 pandemic, and how I want to talk both about how that ties into existing previous strategies and what exactly is new about this. So we've seen two things. The one is the China good, authoritarian systems good, authoritarianism is the system for the 21st century strain. And then the other one, the other strain that we have seen, which is new-ish but not entirely new, is the actual active disinformation to confuse strain. And I want to briefly talk about both of them. So the one thing that we have seen very systematically in this pandemic is promoting the main narrative that China is good and China is stable, and foreign countries are unstable, foreign countries are full of chaos, and you cannot trust foreign countries to handle this. And basically the Chinese system with its structures, its special structures, is perfectly equipped to handle this. The Chinese system is the system of the 21st century, whereas democracies are kind of a bit a relic of the past. They might have been great in the 20th century, but now they're not really equipped to handle the challenges of the 21st century in the same way as China does. This is part of an overall long-term plan. The Chinese government has been working on this for a long time to create what they call confidence in the Chinese system, confidence in the Chinese way, and confidence in Chinese theories. They've been doing this at home with domestic audiences there for a very long time. In the past, they have kind of tried to do this abroad as well, but it's never come out so clearly as in this pandemic. So the idea is you want to create this international, I guess, in a way, echo chamber to make sure that not only Chinese people get the message that the Chinese system is best, but that foreigners acknowledge this as well. And through recognition from foreign countries that play back into China, you can ultimately secure your own position, because ultimately the goal of the party is to stay in power. So almost everything it does is motivated by regime security. So the foreign countries, in a way, serve as an echo chamber for Chinese people at home. So this is domestically motivated, but it's increasingly having ramifications for people, for us as well, because it does impact how we look at things. So what's happened here? The two main things that have been promoted in that regard is, one, of course, China as a reliable partner, as opposed to the United States, which is so concerned with its own problems that it simply cannot help. And in this regard, it's done something that it's also done in the past, which it's approached individual ministries and individual governments, especially at the local level, some in the United States, some in Europe, some in German ministries. In the United States, a state senate, to basically come out with resolutions to praise China and to say that China has handled this incredibly well. This is common. It's only this time the sense that I get is too many people were actually a little offended by China, and so they went public. So now we have this collection of examples of China actually approaching local actors, which in the past, usually that doesn't really come to light. And the other main strain that's been ongoing is, of course, China showing off its effectiveness in handling this pandemic. And there it has worked. It has definitely the asymmetry in the information environment has really helped it, because obviously we do have a lot of images coming out. We had a lot coming out of Italy, out of Spain, out of New York City, images of cities in chaos. And of course, we've had those same images coming out of Wuhan, the city where this originally started, but there the Chinese government has suppressed them. So it can now use the same images coming out of other countries to show that China is handling this well. Everybody else is simply not suited to do this. So how is this different? In a way, to me, it's the first time that the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, is really trying to push this China as the Chinese model, as the model of the 21st century on a global scale, and with certain success. I think the success, if I've already evaluated it, is mixed. I think there are some countries where this is played fairly well. Then there are other countries where I feel like a lot of governments were actually offended by the pressure that was put on them by the Chinese government to praise them, to come out and say China is so good, China's giving us all this equipment, that they had to buy back from China at a very expensive prices.
and
some of it was defective. So I feel like the outcome of this is mixed, but we still shouldn't underestimate the effect that it has had, because China does enjoy certain advantages of being able to filter information one way. The other thing I want to briefly talk about, what we've already, what both previous speakers already mentioned, that's the emergence of Russian-style disinformation. And I have to say, I was personally quite surprised to see this, because in the past, this has been very timid. And usually the way it was done when there was like attempts to really spread disinformation, it was not done through official accounts, but through fringe persons, people that the Chinese government could disassociate itself from. For instance, the Global Times, one paper, it's a subsidiary of the main party mouthpiece, has long been pushing more controversial content, and that would include similar stuff. But now we see the same content from the main party state media. I mean, the main theories, we've heard them all. The US military brought the virus to Wuhan from official MFA spokespersons. Then there was this great effort to make believe that this started in Italy. I've seen a ton of other conspiracy theories that have stayed, that have been less prominent, such as Germany, of course, has the vaccine, hence so few people dead in Germany. Of course, they're trying to spread this to, I don't know, take over the world or something. So a bunch of conspiracy theories. Now, how is this happening? One is the wolf warriors that have already been talked about. Those new accounts that have started popping up since 2019, basically in large part as a response to the protests in Hong Kong. This is obviously, I think everybody probably knows that, but this is not spontaneous activity. This is usually coordinated. They get an order to say, now it's good to have foreign Twitter accounts as well. They had a similar order in 2011 for domestic social media, where all government officials were expected to create their social media accounts. So this is usually coordinated. This is also not a disagreement within the Chinese government. If these people did not have the mandate to do this, they would no longer be there, just because there has been a debate on that. Now, how is this done? There are two things I think that are of notice. One is that there is an attempt to keep a tiny amount of plausible deniability by saying people are speaking in their own capacity, or, well, we're just republishing stuff from other sources. But obviously, when you have the same message coming from so many accounts of authority, that is not credible. The other thing that has been happening that has been quite prominent in this is repurposing of material from Chinese social media. So you won't have a Chinese television commentator writing their own opinion piece, but you will have Chinese media translating posts from Chinese social media. We'll say this was posted on a Chinese social media platform. We're just, FYI, just read it. So it has all those really crazy conspiracy theories in there that are promoted by these very official accounts, but they do keep this thin layer of plausible deniability by saying, oh, we're just sharing with you what Chinese people think, right? So in a way, they're still they're still being careful about it and try to maintain this deniability. Another thing that I found rather interesting that I want to talk about in this disinformation campaign, and this was really obvious in the case of where they tried to say this started in Italy, was the use of more respectable media, like the Alibaba-owned South China Morning Post, in promoting these conspiracy theories. So what happened was they took studies on the virus from abroad and statements from foreigners abroad. There was this Italian doctor that had talked about how he had noticed cases in Italy, and that then was spun by Chinese media into the start in Italy. They also took a study that basically just talked about how this virus first jumped species. Then they said in the South China Morning Post that this means that this virus has been circulating for decades. And then they took it one notch up, linking that these foreign experts, what they say matches what Chinese experts say, which is that this virus didn't start in China. But that also happens in media that previously were quite respectable, and that in a way to me is almost a little more dangerous than wolf warriors on Twitter, because these media do have respectability, and you wouldn't expect this from those more responsible outlets that still do produce some very good journalism. So I think there's a spot to watch there. I think ultimately the goal is not just to create chaos. I do think that the goal is that people are going to go with the Chinese narrative. Not so much that the virus was brought in by the US military on purpose, but the virus didn't start in China. Why do I say that? Because they also insisted in a letter from EU diplomats that they take out a reference that the virus started in China. They insisted on that, and only then could the EU ambassadors publish their letter in a Chinese medium. So I think there really is this concerted effort to make sure that the whole world becomes convinced this did not start in China. Now, to what extent is this new approach different from what's been happening before? One is it moves into the space of more respectable outlets, again, from the fringe, like Global Times, like individuals that have no official capacity, to more respectable spaces, and to make sure that they push the same message. And the aggressive style, which, and Frederick has already spoken about this, how Sweden has been on the receiving end of the really aggressive style of Chinese diplomacy and of Chinese disinformation. What's happening right now is basically the Swedish model is being expanded. Previously, it was the Chinese government makes sure that they only go against a small number of countries that then they really beat up and try to make an example of. I think this is what happened to Sweden. And the audience of that isn't necessarily Sweden. I think in many ways, the audience for that is other European countries, to see if you go up against the Chinese government, here's what we can do to you. So how about you make sure that you don't offend us? But what's happened in this pandemic is this has been taken to a broader level. It's been affecting more countries. France has been affected with quite aggressive diplomacy, other European countries as well. So when I'm asked why this is, I usually tell people what we're currently seeing in terms of this disinformation and the more aggressive push against many countries. It's not necessarily a sign of strength. I don't think that this is an incredibly well thought through strategy, because I do think in the past China has done well for itself, quote unquote, by just going up against a few and by staying away from this. So I do think in a way what we're seeing right now is more or less a product of the crisis mode of decision making that is currently ongoing in China, as the Chinese government itself is under a certain pressure to make up for the economic problems that the virus has been causing. Now, when I say that, I don't say that we shouldn't take it seriously. I do think that's something we need to keep in mind. In terms of the success, I think it'll really be up to us to measure and to figure out ways to how many people does this actually reach here? How many people does it convince? And once we have that information, we can figure out better ways how to deal with that. And I'll close here, and I really look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. And I mean, I think we can also see some cross-posting of narratives, like, for example, Lavrov's op-ed in the Chinese daily newspaper, and I think the narrative is kind of about how European governments have handled COVID-19 really badly, and Russian and Chinese governments have been helping these poor countries, and then on the other hand, these governments have not really appreciated the big effort done by Russia and China. And what I'm wondering is do you think a discourse of a charitable China, or maybe also a charitable Russia, already has been created? And if it has been created, whose job it would be to debunk this narrative and react?
I think it's been partially created. I think what's really interesting about this is the sense that I get, and I haven't done any studies on this, but the sense that I get from talking to people is I think actually large parts of the public, not everyone, but some substantial parts of the public do buy into some of this, also into the authoritarian efficiency, including, China can build a hospital in 10 days. Well, the various European countries have done the same thing, because it's really just an isolation station that is like in a gym. And I do think in certain In some European countries, the governments are buying into that as well. We've seen that from Serbia. We've seen it to some extent from Italy as well. In most countries, I feel like it's part of the public. It's not so much the governments themselves that are really actually quite offended and angered by the way this has been handled. I do think regardless of how widely received this is, there is a role for European governments to at least get some of the facts straight. I'm not saying that we need to respond to every single ridiculous thing. I do think there are some things in terms of aid given by China versus aid given by Europe or by the United States that could be set straight. And it wouldn't make sense to set the record straight. We shouldn't go all out and start engaging in a massive campaign against Chinese communication, because for that, I'm not sure that, I do think they're hurting themselves in some ways more than they're helping themselves, but there is a room for correct information to put that out there in a very low-key, very calm, very objective manner, just to, by the way, here's what's happening. And I'm not saying that every time aid is given, we need to have this huge propaganda crew. We don't have to copy China, but I do think the record needs to be set straight.
Thank you very much. So I think we can now move on to quite a few questions that we have gotten. And one that appeared actually really early is apparently meant for Frederick, and that is the following. Stockholm University was first to open Confucius Institute and closed it in 2015, citing Chinese government influence. Should other EU countries do the same?
The Confucius Institutes and Confucius classrooms in Sweden were criticized very early on compared to other countries for those precise reasons. And from any standard of academic freedom, having a CCP curriculum as part of the education regarding China and Far East Asia is really not compatible with the academic standards of Sweden and many other Western European countries. Of course, it's up to each and every European country to decide what to do with the Confucius Institutes, but they are run by the CCP. These are official outlets of one view on Chinese history, Chinese politics, Chinese policy. And one should be aware of what these institutions actually contain and the goals of Chinese academic institutions, especially over the course of just the last year, where there have been many more regulations, to the best of my understanding, regarding the curriculum of Chinese higher education facilities to include more messaging about the party and less about, say, Western ideas or critical and independent thinking.
Yeah, thank you. Well, and another question is actually about China's soft power, and a tool of China's soft power has always been China's diplomats. And one question is asking why China's diplomats took an amplitude of a bully in Europe. It seems they act in opposition to their soft power image. Whoever would want to answer that? Yes, Mike.
Why would they act like bullies if they're hurting China's image? I don't think this is a sign of strength. I think this is a sign of things in China, of the Chinese leadership currently acting in crisis mode. And crisis mode does trigger some sort of erratic decision making. Now, I'm speculating here. I obviously cannot look into Xi Jinping's head. I cannot look into the head of anybody there. I do know that I do think there is some genuine disagreement among Chinese diplomats on whether this is good or bad. I know that some more established diplomats do actively despise this. I do think that with the whole focus on primarily domestic concerns. And on domestic legitimacy, and that includes domestic nationalism, because if you look at the two pillars of legitimacy, economic delivery, like delivering economic output, and nationalism, right now you kind of have to ride with nationalism because it's very hard to ride with the economic delivery of outputs, right? That means that this is now, there's a chance for people to experiment with this more. This approach has previously, like I said, it's been used before, but usually the party makes sure to only use it against a few, to make an example of them, and then be very nice and very constructive and very helpful, quote unquote, to everybody else. So I do think the way that this is now used quite broadly is a product of this crisis mode. And it's not, the Chinese government isn't helping itself with this.
Thank you. Another question that we have is, well, it doesn't go really a lot within the question of the information environment, but it's still there. Forced organs harvesting in China from prisoners, what can West do to stop it? And I think the big question actually that we have been discussing here is, will West dare to challenge China? Maybe Frederick, you could address this?
Organ harvesting and the human rights abuses and a long list of issues from China is, I've often said this in the case of Kremlin influence activities, which I worked with several years ago, that Western nations need to remember its own ideals and uphold its own standards when it comes and place demands on trade partners and diplomatic channels, etc. When it comes to a case of China, having a confrontation with China for the sake of the confrontation is not constructive. After all, we want to both eat the cookie and have it. But we should not abandon, we meaning the Western powers, should not abandon our own ideals when it comes to human rights, freedom of the press, since that plays into the hands of the CCP, who after all, they are looking for ways to question our democracies, how hypocritical we can be perceived when we on the one hand advocate for human rights, on the other hand we allow for concentration camps in Xinjiang without any comments at all.
Yes, thank you, Frederick. Well, so there's also significant evidence of covert Chinese operations on social media. And for example, ProPublica uncovered a network on Twitter which was involved in a coordinated influence campaign with ties to the Chinese government. The Daily Telegraph found Chinese state media circumventing social media platforms' political ad rules and buying advertising that was praising China's handling of the COVID-19 and also attacking the US. And for example, according to the Daily Telegraph, the ads are a part of a worldwide propaganda campaign coordinated across Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and traditional media, attempting to depict China as a global leader in the fight against COVID-19 and drown out accusations that it made the crisis worse by trying to cover up its own outbreak. And also thousands of tweets with pro-China hashtags published in a 2-week period in March came from bots. Erika, you already also touched upon not only about what's happening in traditional media, but also about what's happening in social media. So where do you see this situation going, and how do you see social media platforms reacting, and maybe what should we expect from them?
a difficult question to answer. I'm not sure the platforms themselves know what to expect. But I do think, all of these signs of sort of covert activity, this is also, I guess one thing to add to that is the takedowns on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube late last year around August in conjunction with disinformation around the Hong Kong protests. So Twitter took down, I think it was something like 200,000 accounts, saying it was the first time that they really uncovered a Chinese state-backed operation of this nature. I think it's a sign that also goes back to the question of why are people acting like bullies. I think this is a time of experimentation for China. I think, COVID, if you look at the leading small group that was established in January to take control, to set policy on COVID, 2 of the 9 members of that come from the party's propaganda apparatus. So messaging, which suggests to me that perhaps, the leadership felt that messaging was going to be an important part of how to manage this crisis. And I think this foray into social media, a lot of it is new. A lot of it is experimentation, and a lot of it is going to see what works, what are the costs and what are the benefits. And so as China tries to work that out, what are the costs and what are the benefits, I think its policies and its strategy will evolve. But I do think it raises serious questions for the platforms themselves as they see other state actors moving more aggressively to capture real estate on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. I think one very simple measure is disclosure. And, YouTube has had this disclosure policy on the books for years. Its implementation, even after numerous journalistic exposés, remains uneven. Facebook and Twitter are also trying to calibrate their policies about disclosing state-backed content. So that's sort of, transparency is kind of the first easy answer, I guess.
And also there have been a lot of reports talking about different ways how Chinese Communist Party has leaked in their narratives into bigger Western media, for example, through op-eds. And what is your take on that?
Go ahead.
Sorry, technical difficulties, unmuting myself. I think part of the problem with op-eds that there is the simple asymmetry, and Chinese politicians can publish over here, whereas our politicians can't publish in Chinese media, which in a way the op-ed that I mentioned earlier from the EU ambassadors was a way to combat that and to say, oh, now we can publish in Chinese media. Now the problem, of course, was that they were published in English language media, which don't reach many Chinese people at all, except a handful that want to practice their English and certainly aren't looking for messages from EU ambassadors. They just want to learn English. I think that is a bit of a problem. I'm slightly more concerned about the media agreements that are signed in terms of content exchange between very reputable media organizations in Western countries and Chinese media, like news agencies like Xinhua, where then a great deal of content is actually shared. Like a lot of this won't be very straight propaganda. A lot of it will be about economic issues. There is a great hype about Belt and Road, but that is actually a way that a lot more information from Chinese media organizations will enter our mainstream media, and it may or may not be. It probably say Xinhua, but most readers don't really pay that much attention to where it originally comes from, especially if they don't know what Xinhua is. They'll just see, oh, Reuters or AFP or whatever is publishing this great piece, and it gives it legitimacy. And the third thing that I've been seeing is also corporations on specific projects. We recently had a small scandal in Germany about public broadcaster teaming up with Chinese party state media to broadcast a documentary about Wuhan. Now, of course, the party state media are the last source where you want to get your information from Wuhan from. But somehow the people who are responsible for this corporation didn't really understand China, and they didn't think twice about it. They just thought, oh, great, we're getting inside information from Wuhan. So I'm really less worried about the op-eds and the information asymmetry there than I'm a lot more worried about these covert ways that our own media, through cooperation, through ignorance or willful ignorance, actually give Chinese media content quite massive platforms. And I think this is where actually our own media have to get smarter on China and start understanding the structures and the goals behind this better, so that they can, the next time they're approached or they approach someone, they can just say, sorry, but no.
I think the other half of that equation is the deteriorating situation for the foreign press in China. So, we've seen these expulsions of foreign journalists, which cuts down on the Western media's ability to report in a nuanced and informed way about China. I think for a long time, a lot of people in China have rejected the Western model of media. They have a completely different model of how the media should function. And it has always been difficult to get people to engage with you. I think that's only getting harder. So, this fear or lack of willingness to engage also allows official state-backed sources to capture a greater share of the narrative.
Yes, and probably, we have heard a lot about how Russian propaganda works, and journalists probably are more critical towards that and more aware of what's happening, and maybe less critical about things that come from China. And their media, yeah. So there is one last question that I would like to address. I kind of think that we already slightly addressed it. So China is facing a demographic crisis, aging population. Is China running out of time? And the focus on info-ops is driven by desperation. Well, I think Mareike looks really excited to answer that question.
Not really. It's not really it's far from my specialty. I do think this ties into the greater theme of how a lot of what we're seeing and a lot of the pressure for the Chinese government to gain support from foreigners really ties into domestic pressure. That includes both acute economic difficulties, like I've already mentioned. It does also to some degree include larger demographic problems that tie into, will China be old before it gets rich, which right now it's looking that way. And it simply shows that, yes, this is all part of the Chinese government needing support from foreign countries to make sure that its development goes as smoothly as possible and encounters as few obstacles as possible internationally. And this is, of course, what it serves to basically make sure that things go well at home, and that basically any way you look at it always comes down to domestic regime security. Now, that's not the only factor, but it's one more factor that we do have to keep in mind.
Yes, thank you. Well, this is a really exciting conversation, but we have to slowly start wrapping up. And I will give you one last chance to maybe say a few closing statements. And I was just wondering if we can maybe end on a slightly positive note. Otherwise, it kind of seems that China has had its public diplomacy victory, and the West is, struggling. I will start with Erika.
I don't know if we can think about this in terms of victory and loss. I'm not sure anybody has really had a victory here. I mean, I think that this is an evolving system, and I would just add to what Mareike was saying. Certainly, regime stability is the ultimate goal, but I think, from China's perspective, there's also a positive effort to this. I think for years the party's been trying to figure out how to tell its own story more effectively around the world. They come from such a different media environment, and they're trying to sort of get their legs and figure out how to communicate more effectively internationally. If you try to think about it from China's perspective, it's got to be really frustrating to keep getting hammered by Western journalists. That's just not the way the Chinese media function. So I think there is, as well as this sort of fear-based, motivation, I think there is this, aspiration to try to find a more powerful voice, on the international stage from China's perspective. I do think that, there is, I think that Western platforms and Western governments have learned a lot from their experience with Russia, particularly during the 2016 campaign, and already are thinking actively about approaches to handle information operations. So, you know, I think it's not without hope. And, you know, we'll see what, I think it's too early to say in the end what the costs and benefits of China's changing strategy are.
Thank you. Frederick?
On a positive remark, I would say that the increased awareness of the CCP influence activities will rekindle interest in China and the Chinese, a broader range, all the beneficial aspects of the nation of China, the Chinese people, Chinese culture, etc. So we will eventually be able to have a much more constructive relationship. But we need to know what. We haven't been dealing with items such as Communist Party, Politburo, Central Committee for many, many years. And we need to realize that the regime is authoritarian, but we do not want to exclude China either. The term decoupling, which is so popular right now, is a very, very, very complex being. I do not believe that we ourselves know what we mean when we are discussing a decoupling from China. We will have to find a way to have a more balanced relationship with both China and the CCP. And we also have to remember that after all, we both want prosperity, but we would prefer to have prosperity without autocracy.
Thank you, Frederick. Mareike?
I'm a pessimist by nature, so I am delighted to give the optimist closing remarks. In all seriousness, though, I am quite, I mean, I'm not optimistic about the overall outlook of the world per se right now, because I think we're facing a lot of problems, and the COVID-19 crisis is going to stay with us for years, if not decades. That said, I do not consider this a victory for the CCP at all, in terms of the CCP is now coming in and taking over Europe with all its narratives. Like I said, this is not coming from a position of strength. This is coming from a position of weakness. This is coming in a way that finally more countries, more politicians, more people are beginning to understand what is happening. And I basically now, before it was like, oh, China is completely irrelevant, and you were talking about Chinese disinformation, you're making all that up, I can't see it at all. And now I can say, no, but look, A, B, C, D, and E. So people are finally beginning to understand what is happening. Awareness is growing. And that really is the first important step to be able to raise your understanding of the country and the regime you're dealing with, and then be able to counter it. So in a way, this pandemic has given the perfect example to really show people what this is about. And while I wish we could have gone without it, that does make me slightly optimistic that going forward, at least Europe will take this more seriously and will take appropriate steps.
Thank you, and really thank you for taking this time. I understand that currently experts are living in a situation when they are jumping from one Zoom meeting to another, and thank you for sparing this 1 hour to have this conversation, and I wish you all the best luck in your future research efforts and a lot of energy. And I would also want to thank everyone who was posting questions and comments in our comment section. We really value your time and effort. And I hope we managed to answer at least, well, I think we managed to answer actually most of the questions that you posed. And it is clear that these types of influence operations are adapting and evolving with time, and we all need to stay alert. And speaking of alert, we still have a few more webinars ahead, actually 2. And the next one is going to take place again on Wednesday, so basically same time and same place as well. Thank you for watching, and stay safe.